expecting the government to give you honest information about inflation is like expecting the mafia to give you honest information about crime. I mean, obviously, the mafia has a vested interest in pretending there's less crime, especially since they're the ones that are committing it. But if the public thinks there's not a lot of crime, well, then we don't need a lot of police, right? And the mafia obviously doesn't want to have to bribe more police officers, so they don't want to come out with a report that indicates a lot of crime. They want to say, hey, there's no crime at all. In fact, we can get rid of some of the police officers we have because we hardly have any crime. Well, it's the same incentive for the government. The government is much better off if it reports low inflation than high inflation. I mean, first of all, an obvious reason is inflation's a bad thing. I mean, voters don't like inflation. They don't like their cost of living going up. So why deliver bad news to the voters? If you can lie to the voters and pretend that inflation is lower than it really is, right? That's great for politicians because they don't want to give voters bad news, because then the voters may vote to elect somebody else, right? Oh, hey, inflation is bad. I'm going to blame the incumbent, so I'm going to vote for the challenger. Well, if we're told, hey, there is no inflation, well, that's one less reason to vote for somebody else. But also, inflation reveals the true cost of very popular government programs. And a lot of these programs would be a lot less popular if people realized how much they cost. If people understood that they're paying higher prices to finance government spending, that inflation is a tax. And so to the extent that the government lies about inflation, then it hides the true cost of these government programs. So voters continue to think they're getting something for nothing, and so they keep reelecting the politicians who are giving them something for nothing. If they realize that, wait a minute, my cost of living is going up X as a result of paying for all this stuff that I thought was free, it's not really free, and now all of a sudden those politicians that are providing it don't look as good, and maybe you'll vote for somebody else. Another reason, though, that the government has a vested interest in underreporting inflation is, by definition, when you do that, you overreport GDP growth, because we always adjust the GDP numbers for inflation. But if you undercount inflation, then you're not decreasing GDP enough. And so, in other words, you're overstating how much the economy is growing. Now, politicians always want to brag about GDP growth because that is the barometer that they're using, or one of the barometers to measure the success of their policies. So if you could lie and artificially inflate the GDP by undercounting inflation, well, you can pretend the economy is better than it really is. You can take credit for economic growth that didn't really take place. It makes you look good. Again, it's like a student. If you could do lousy work but still bring home an A on your report card, you could impress your parents. Hey, look, I got an A, even though you actually flunked because you wrote your own report card. So you have these politicians can tell the voters, hey, look how good a job we're doing. Look at how much the economy is growing, when it's not really growing. It's just that we're lying to you about inflation, but we're not telling it. But there's also real savings to the government when it comes to undercounting inflation. Social Security benefits are indexed to inflation. There's a COLA. So every year, people get more money based on the CPI. Now, of course, Social Security is broke. The government doesn't have the money, but no politician has the guts to officially vote to reduce Social Security benefits, right? Social Security is the third rail. No one's going to touch that. But the government touches Social Security every year. Nobody knows, and that's through the COLAs. Because if Social Security recipients are supposed to get a cost of living increase every year, but if the government lies about what inflation is, then that increase is much lower than it legally should be. And so what undercounting inflation does, when you report a CPI that is much lower than the actual increase in the cost of living, you are cutting Social Security benefits, but no politician has to make the politically embarrassing vote. Who wants to cast a vote to cut Social Security? Nobody. So the best way to do it, because everybody knows we need to cut Social Security, but everybody's afraid to do it, well, let's just lie about the CPI. And then we can have these cuts without anybody having to risk voting for it and not getting reelected. But a rigged CPI also adds to government revenue. Look at the income tax. A lot of the tax code is indexed to inflation. And the index they use is the CPI. The standard deduction is indexed. The personal exemptions are indexed. The tax brackets, they're all indexed to inflation. And so to the extent that the government underreports inflation, those brackets are not adjusted enough. And so taxpayers end up paying higher taxes without anybody voting to increase their taxes. Again, politicians don't like to vote to raise taxes, but they want more revenue. So the way they can get more revenue without raising taxes is to lie about the inflation numbers. So they lie about them. Also, what about interest on the national debt? I mean, first of all, you got Treasury inflation protected securities. Those are TIPS. Those are specifically indexed to the CPI. So the higher the CPI is, the more interest the government has to pay on its TIPS. So if it lies about the CPI, well, then it pays lower interest. The government calculates the CPI. The government is the one that benefits from a low CPI and suffers from a high CPI. It's the ultimate in hiring the fox to guard your hen house. Obviously, we're getting the results that we would expect. Why so many people think it's crazy to believe that the CPI is somehow biased or skewed when there are so many incentives for the government that is compiling it to skew it in a lower direction. But also, it's not just tips. The U.S. government, the national debt, which, by the way, just passed 29 trillion. We're almost at 30 trillion. But the U.S. government is the biggest debtor in the world, probably in the entire universe. Maybe if there's life on other planets, I would be willing to bet that our government has more debt than any government on any other planet orbiting any star in any part of the universe. But in any event, because the government has this much debt, the U.S. government is more exposed than ever to an increase in interest rates. And one of the reasons that interest rates go up is higher inflation. The higher inflation is, the greater the premium that borrowers demand to compensate them for that loss of purchasing power. So by fooling lenders into believing that inflation is lower than it really is, the government could borrow at a lower rate of interest than it would otherwise be able to borrow at if it reported a higher rate of inflation. So the government saves a tremendous amount of money by understating inflation, which is exactly why they do it. And of course, it is this vulnerability